Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this roundtable or seminar called Rebuilding Trust in International Institutions Through Subnational Engagement. We are so thrilled here at NIUR and Cary Worldhouse to be sponsoring this roundtable. We have the world's experts in thinking about subnational government and their role in international affairs. They've been in government, they've been in academia, they've actually led places, and been very involved in this particular activity. And with us today are, first, Michele Acuto, who is the professor of Global Urban Politics and director of the Melbourne Center of Cities at the University of Melbourne. He's joined by Burke-White, who's professor of law at the University of Pennsylvania, Lolita Jackson, executive director of communications and sustainable cities at the Sustainable Development Capital, LLP, Ian Klaus, senior fellow, Global Cities and Foreign Policy, the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and Mauricio Rodas, visiting scholar, Kleinman Center for Energy Policy, Penn IUR, and Cary Worldhouse. So we've been talking about this topic of rebuilding trust in international institutions through subnational engagement for many years now. However, a lot of things have happened in the world since we were last met as a group, which was about, pre-pandemic. And so we're hoping you will reflect right now, today, what has happened, what's changed in terms of this conversation that we're going to embark in today that we're picking up from a while ago. Bill?
Well, thanks, Jeannie, and great to see all of these friends, some in person and some on Zoom, but it's wonderful to be reconvened. I think a lot has changed on both sides of the equation. Let me start on the trust in international institutions side and then the subnational engagement side. I think our international institutional architecture is to some degree in crisis at the moment. And that means trust is breaking down more than ever. You know, we convene as Russia may well be invading the Ukraine, violating the most powerful Grundnorm of the international institutional order, Article 2.4 of the UN Charter. And we are at a crisis moment on so many of the great global challenges, be it climate change, be it vaccine access for the pandemic. And so I think there is a kind of skepticism right now about whether international institutions deserve our trust, whether they're capable of solving the sort of great challenges we face today. And I think that is maybe something the international institutions themselves are becoming aware of. And perhaps that is also a reason they may be looking for new sources of legitimacy or new efforts to build trust. Maybe the era in which those institutions built trust by preventing Cold War conflict has given way to an era where those institutions have to build trust from the ground up. And so I think this flux in the structure of the global power system and flux in kind of the ability of institutions creates an opening. And then what's new from down below, from the subnational level, I think are, again, several things. This discussion was often theoretical when we were having it 4 or 5 years ago, or limited to the sectors like UN Habitat, which was a wonderful meeting, but was a meeting about cities. And today, whether it's how the UN deals with regions like the Donbass, or climate change or pandemic response, subnational is now really at the table in a new way, in a more meaningful way. And I think there is a much more acute sense of the connection between the global institutional mandates that, whether it's vaccines or pandemics or whatever else, and the importance that multiple layers of government have to play in solving that. And maybe that's a lesson of the pandemic, maybe it's a lesson of climate being more acute, or maybe it's a lesson of the fact that Luhansk is a city and suddenly it's a country, but we've got to somehow figure out where it sits in this architecture.
Oh, that's a really terrific overview of the things that we've been experiencing in the past year or two. And Lolita, you've been in government, now you're in the private sector. What are you thinking about this particular topic?
So for those of you, first of all, I'm very pleased to be on this panel because these are all old friends of mine. It's just really great to be together with everyone again. I was in the mayor's office for 15 years of New York City. And my last job was as climate diplomat for New York City, so I'm really speaking from that standpoint. And I really want to speak from a bottom-up, city-led standpoint, just to give the other viewpoint from the bottom, so to speak. The Trump years really highlighted the importance of cities and states acting to fill that gap created by the federal lack of action on climate at the time. So cities like New York City began to be more prominent in international discussions, as evidenced by the large amount of subnational governments that attended COP26. There were many, many cities that probably would never have attended before that attended that particular COP, but even there was more attendance at previous COPs that happened during the Trump years, as there was really not a large federal government presence. So cities such as Orlando and Pittsburgh sent representatives and even their mayors in many instances to COP. And Speaker Pelosi held an event featuring 20 members of Congress. There were also many, many side events, one of which I held with my new company, specifically for cities, states, and regions. And that particular day of COP was very well attended and very robust and vigorous, both the official events and the unofficial side events. And I just think in the area of climate in general, it's been widely recognized now that the global climate goals that the international bodies are coming together and putting forth won't happen without concerted involvement of subnational governments, where the initiatives will actually have to be put in practice, particularly those who have devolved power, that have many powers on their own that can act independently of a federal or international mandate, or they may not. So I'll end there.
So Bill exposed us to the global issues that we're challenged with right now. You talked about climate. What do you see, Michele, in Australia with this conversation?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because when you sent the question, I sort of went, oh, well, the pandemic. From our perspective, I think what hasn't changed, what has consolidated is the peculiarity of our corner of the globe, if a globe has corners, but the reality of being in this part of the world. That if anything, we've been sort of pushed further, not just Australia, but say New Zealand, Indonesia, so the major countries in our side of the world, to think about ourselves. And that's sort of an artifice of being so disaggregated from the centrality of Euro-American conversations or crises or debates. The geography came back to bite quite sizably for us. And I guess sort of that meant that in the artifice of where we were going with global urban governance and the explosion of networks and the explosion of platforms and conferences and events and so forth, that really got shaken up quite dramatically at both local, state, and central level. Everyone's far more pragmatic as to what engagements really matter. And I think it has lots to do with the question of trust that sort of we started with Bill. How much do we trust those global engagements from here if they feel further away? But I guess the other thing is a quick reflection to start with from here is if it ever left, the state is really squarely back in town, and central local relations is sort of absolutely critical to the region, not just us. Insofar that the way that's gone in different parts of the world is really been different for us. So central state relations, central local relations have gone even further apart here, potentially a bit similar to the UK. And the same story you can have across the region. So in a sense, it's almost impossible now to think as optimistically as you were thinking before about sort of mayors getting on planes and doing great things in these forums. And the layer of the state is so critical in our side of the world that maybe we had just forgotten it a bit with the craze of mayors ruling the world before.
Well, that's disturbing to hear that there's a greater distance, for heaven's sakes, in your part of the world. Ian, you were engaged at the State Department. Now you've had time to reflect on some of that. What do you see?
This is fun. It's like the world over the last 3 years in 2 minutes. You know, and it's a fun group to be back together with. I'll say, sort of, as we assess what we're seeing, in some ways we're assessing the success or the unexpected consequences or lack thereof of our own work, I guess, because so many of us have been active, not just as scholars, but in the policy space here. And I would also, I think, observe that there is so much activity now around subnational engagement in global governance that meetings like this or workshops like this or seminars are especially exciting, because I think it is almost impossible to see it all, to have a sense. If anyone does it, well, maybe Michele, because he never sleeps, and they've kept him off an airplane for a while, so he's been reading and watching and participating in everything. But it makes general observations a little hard to hazard. If I were to offer one, I think I would share with Michele's need to think again about the resilience of the state, and particularly in this place. I think there have been a couple of developments that are interesting, or trends. And as we assess networks and IOs and global governance, I'm struck, one, by the turn of many of the leading networks to sort of bilateral relations with states. On the first hand, and on the second, the really significantly different success, attention, care, expertise paid by national governments to subnational engagement, particularly through networks. Some of them are very good at it. Some of them like the signal that they're very good at it, and some of them could care less. And I think those two meetings are two trends that I find quite important right now.
So, Mauricio, you were involved in U20. You've been watching the UN with our common agenda, and what the Secretary General is making some actions towards nods towards subnational government. Where are you on this particular question?
Thank you, Eugénie. It is great to be part of this conversation with a fantastic group of friends and experts. So, obviously, the most traumatic event that the world has experienced in the past couple of years is the COVID-19 pandemic. So when it comes to analyzing how subnational governments have been building trust in their relationship with the international institutional architecture, one necessarily has to refer to the role that, for example, cities played during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we saw many examples of cities around the world going above and beyond national governments in their level of effectiveness with dealing with the pandemic. We saw extraordinary demonstrations of leadership from mayors around the globe in spite of not having enough competences and in spite of having not enough financial resources to deal with the pandemic. They surpassed national government's effectiveness in many cases. And I think that because of that, once again, cities demonstrated that they are at the forefront of dealing with some of the world's most pressing issues, like climate change, like migration, and now, of course, pandemics. So I think that there's a greater acknowledgement of the role of cities and, in general, subnational governments to deal with these kinds of issues. I also agree with Lolita in the sense of we saw during COP26 in Glasgow a greater level of participation from cities. We saw mayors not only attending COP26 during World Cities Day, but also during World Leaders Day, which is something important to highlight. So there's a greater recognition of the importance of cities to tackle climate change. Now, unfortunately, I also have to say that I think there are also missed opportunities here. I was expecting that after several developed countries and multilateral development banks set up multi-billion-dollar recovery packages to deal with the post-COVID-19 era, I thought that much of those resources were going to be disbursed directly into cities. And unfortunately, that hasn't been the case. I thought we are missing that opportunity as a game changer for the international financial system to make it more friendly for cities, for subnational governments. So even though I still think that we have time to change that, that will require a huge effort regarding advocacy at the international level to advance in profound reforms to the international financial architecture to make it more friendly, more open to the needs that subnational governments are having worldwide.
Thank you, Mauricio. I share your enthusiasm, but I'm a little taken back by Ian, who talked about the networks. The networks being not as strong, I think you were saying, Ian, that they're resorting to bilateral negotiations rather than pushing the larger network agendas. I'm not sure if that's what you meant, but all of you here around this table on hybrid have been involved in networks. I'd love to hear some of your opinions on what's happening with the networks. I think I'll throw this out back to Mauricio, because he's been very involved in many networks, and then I'll bring it around the table.
Well, I mean, I think that some city networks are doing a great job in advancing the city's agenda in different fields. But of course, again, they have to face an international institutional architecture that was designed for countries. It wasn't designed for subnational governments. And that's where these networks are having a very, very hard time to advance into concrete results that will help cities and subnational governments to keep doing what they need to do, which is, tackling climate change and so on and so forth. Without, for example, an effective role from cities, it will be impossible to defeat climate change, since it is in cities where more than 70% of CO2 emissions are taking place. But in order for cities to do that in an adequate way, they need funding. And again, cities are encountering a number of obstacles to access international finance to undertake the kind of infrastructure transformation they need to undertake to advance in the climate agenda. Certain networks like C40, like the Global Covenant of Mayors and others, have been struggling to reform that financial system. We saw some encouraging announcements during COP26, but not nearly enough. We are very far from where we need to be in terms of getting concrete results out of the effort that several networks are doing.
Bill, networks.
So I'm a little worried about network proliferation. There's a lot of networks out there at the moment. And legitimacy, when we're thinking about sort of this meta question of legitimacy, comes in part from networks sort of delivering on things. And I worry a little that there's too much networks for network's sake, as opposed to networks as a means of solving a problem. And when I think about what I'd like to see networks do is really focus on delivering some tangible results. And I think if we had maybe somewhat fewer, more coordinated networks that were really focused on outcomes and results, that might be a good change. I also think in terms of networks, the way networks engage with, so networks are informal institutions, right? They're groupings of cities, and they operate in parallel to these formal international organizations. And sometimes in a very explicit parallel, like the U20, G20 relationship. But I think we still don't have a very good set of mechanisms for linking those informal city networks, or even formal city networks, but small form institutions, with the traditional international institutional architecture. And doing better, whether it's the U20 talking to the G20 or the Global Parliament of Mayors talking to the General Assembly, or whatever the appropriate parallels are, stitching those institutions, the international institutions, with the networks, I think is the piece we haven't figured out. We do really well at pulling networks together, but getting them to interact with the traditional architecture in more productive ways would be our next challenge there.
Well, how about interacting with each other?
Yeah.
There's another one. Lolita, in your role down the private sector, do you turn to networks in any way? Or?
Well, I want to talk a little bit about my past role, because I was actually a New York City person charged with dealing with all the networks, at least
Okay.
in climate, so I have a very unique perspective on this. And a couple of things that people may not see from the top when they're looking from the outside is that there's very sort of practical things that happen on a network level that may not rise to the level of being seen by international or national level entities. So a couple examples. In C40, which is something that we've talked about earlier, where it's a network of mayors of global cities, and Mauricio was a member of C40 in the past when he was mayor of Acuto. every city involved in that had to put together a climate action plan by a certain timing, or they actually were asked to reassess whether they should be members or could be members of C40. So that was a very concrete activity they were asked to do. There were also calls led by mayors Garcetti and Sala during COVID in the immediate days afterward by all the global mayors. So from Mayor Khan, Mayor Hidalgo, Mayor de Blasio, they were all on these phone calls together, and that was kept quiet, but that was being done in the immediate days of COVID when our cities had many people unfortunately perishing pretty quickly from it and trying to share best practices. And then in general, they actually are connected with the UN regarding making sure that some of the findings and the discussions get to the UN piece, and also they have speakers from the UN come to their events to speak when it's the global summit and things like that. So there is some interactivity, and I know that the UN Secretary General actually met with a group of global mayors privately during COP26 that was convened by C40. So there are some very pragmatic, practical things that happen, but they may not be seen as widely externally. So just, you know.
Well, that's really interesting. They don't have a seat at the table, but you're saying behind the table they may be doing some things,
Yes.
which is, I think is quite interesting. Michele, you've made a lifetime's work of studying networks, right? You want to tell us? I wouldn't say lifetime, but you've done very important, you and Ian have done very important work on networks.
Look, and that might be a problem in a way. I guess devil's advocate, so for context, as the pandemic started, we sort of wrapped up a pretty large piece of work on sort of tallying the networks and figuring out what they look like and what do they do and where are they going. And it's sort of fairly paradoxical that we basically wrapped it up on month one of the pandemic. So we sort of then scrambled back and we're going back to that piece to figure out if the geography of networks
Have
is
you
changing.
and Ian together?
So a group of us here.
Oh, different group. Okay, I thought you and Ian worked on that together. Okay.
You can tally the amount of things that you and I might have done. No, and I guess the reason why I'm flagging that is that we're diving back into that in the sense of saying, how has this changed? It was a presumed fairly flat reality before, but as you, I guess, reading between the lines, Eugénie, just alluded, it isn't a flat reality. It's a very splintered reality. It really changes the story if you talk about culture rather than migration, rather than peacekeeping, rather than climate. And it's got a big political economy of networks behind that we sort of always tend to not really talk about, but who pays for what, where are the resources and so on. So I think that two bits of reflection there for me is 100% what Lolita is saying. I guess devil's advocate, putting myself in the city of Melbourne, well, not speaking for the city of Melbourne, putting myself in the city rather than the university, the question could be, well, who cares if we meet with the Secretary General? Probably more interested in a closed doors working group with 5 major multilaterals or multinationals that invest. So the bit that Mauricio was saying is the big missed opportunities of the direct investment. That would drive activity, or the technical exchange on how did you set up parklets to keep restaurants open during the pandemic? That sort of stuff is still there and is still a really strong value proposition for the cities, I would argue. But equally sort of pushed a bit into, does another summit matter? Does another joint statement of mayors really matter? Does just showing up versus exchanging really matter? So one of the interesting things might be that the value proposition of the UN engagement might have fallen down a bit over the last 2 years, but not necessarily the value proposition of we've got a pretty great program on night justice and safety for women. We very practically leverage one of these networks to learn what London did a bunch of exchanges on that, and now we're working with Los Angeles on it. Do we care as to whether that's connected to CEDAW and the Convention on Women and UN Women? Not particularly, but the value of that exchange, I think the value proposition is still pretty strong. So I think we're at a crux for networks as to maybe rethinking the value proposition a bit beyond the global agenda implementation and going a bit back to the basics. And I guess the last thing to flag is there's a few areas, migration is a perfect one in point, where mayors and institutions like OSF and so forth have gotten together and went, well, we probably don't need a network, we just need a working group or a program. And have proven that that really worked with the Mayor's Migration Council as an example. So then the question is, do we all need more networks, or actually do we need to have more variety of that type of engagement?
Okay, Ian, you've got the last word here. You're the one who started this argument, saying that they're meeting bilaterally and not doing much. And Michele saying they're symbolic, maybe they're doing some good things around particular topics. Lolita's got them behind the scenes. Mauricio was very active in them. Bill says they got to get their act together. What do you say?
Perhaps I misspoke, Gene. I didn't mean to say they weren't doing much. I just meant to sort of capture in part what Michele just said with regards to a little turn away from the seat of the table question in global governance and towards other avenues of diplomacy. But I think it's a very interesting area. And Michele just hinted at something that maybe we can pursue later, which was reasons why Melbourne Center for Cities went to a network. And of course, there are the things that networks want, and there are things that people want of networks. And I actually think that process and the way those requests happen is actually not by Melbourne, but is often an understudied or under-discussed one, because they are an access point to a lot of knowledge and research and resources, obviously. I'm looking at this group, and if you just looking at it, we've probably engaged and worked with or for most of the major networks in the world and their colleagues. And so you can turn to some of the work that the Chicago Council in Melbourne has done, and some of the super rigorous work that Michele and Melbourne have done for some of the data on the 300 plus networks, et cetera. But I think something that this group has, and why those observations are really helpful, is the sort of nitty gritty experience inside the networks and working with them, and what that ecosystem feels like a little bit behind the scenes. And so just 3 observations building on what I heard there. I'm continually struck by the sort of level of diplomacy of the city diplomats at city networks. It is starting to already does rival diplomats on the national scale. It hasn't always looked that way. Now it does. I bet Lolita could speak to that at length. But the professionalization, the formalization of the processes is, to me, something that is noteworthy. Second, and this is referenced with regards to the pandemic, the flexibility that they demonstrated, for instance, that immediately when the pandemic hit, both in terms of technical exchange, but also calls to action, was, to me, really, really striking. And then a third point before just a final thought. Eugénie, you mentioned the culture and the competition. I think one of the things it is worth reflecting on when you've seen city networks from the inside is not just the question of why are there so many, but the difficulties of, Bill referenced what kind of institutions they are. Are they programs, or are they workshops, or do they have secretariats? There is competition between them, and they do need resources. And they do sometimes have overlapping missions. And the question of how that will all play out is, to me, sort of a very interesting and serious one, but we shouldn't deny that it exists. They have very different cultures, for example. Finally, I don't think, and I would love to work on this more and hear more from the group. Mauricio, Eugénie, you guys have both been highly involved with the U20. I think Michele is now ongoing. Just using that as a case study in terms of figuring out that final step of setting up, as Bill said, the parallel institutions of sorts, whether they're formal or informal, between ongoing sort of global governance and cities and subnational, and then how to take that last final step of influence and engagement is something that I feel like still eludes a lot of us who are doing this work, myself included. Convening the right people in the room is something, but I'm not sure we figured out exactly what the ask is, or what the implementation is, or what the leverage is with the national government sort of in the IO multilateral space.
Can I just do a quick 2-finger response to
Yes,
Ian?
please do.
Ian, my optimism here is that it may be that the international side is starting to see the imperative of implementation at the subnational level. So even where the subnational may not know what the ask is, on things like pandemic and climate, I think we're seeing a greater recognition at the supranational level that you're going to have to direct implementation toward the subnational. And maybe it will be the supranational that solves that problem on the demand side, where the cities themselves haven't yet figured it out.
because they can't get it done without them. Mauricio wants to also.
Yes, just a quick note on the U20. I think the U20 is a very interesting example to analyze, because the U20, first of all, is not a network. It is an initiative that was established by C40 and UCLG, so two city networks that got together to create or to promote the idea of the Urban 20, which sounds very interesting because it's not about creating another network, but actually having existing networks joining forces to develop something different. The problem is that even though I think the U20 has a huge potential, unfortunately, many people think of the U20 as a city network, and that's a mistake. Because the U20 is a G20 engagement group. It has a totally different nature. And once we recognize that, then we will be in a position to take full advantage of the potential of the U20. For me, having the U20 is like having a Porsche parked in your garage without taking it for a ride. We need to take the Porsche out of the garage and taking it for a ride.
So Michele, were you involved in the U20 this past year? No, not at all.
No, we're looking from the outside, but also we don't have
Okay, all right. No one here last year, but we have Indonesia coming up, and we'll see are you going to be involved in Indonesia? That will be coming up. We'll see what happens there. Okay. Let's have some practical examples of things that have worked with the engagement of subnational governments with besides COVID. Can you think of things that have worked in the past? Obviously, the COVID situation is one that we can see and have experienced and so forth, but are there predecessor good practices or best practices that are creating a value proposition, that are changing policy, that are getting the conversations going among the levels of government and so forth?
I'll throw one out that we don't talk about as much, and we're always talking about pandemic or climate, but that's human rights. And Mauricio was at my human rights class last night talking about this. But human rights is something that I think there is a recognition that implementation has to happen in part locally, right? A national government may be able to set certain human rights policies, but the actual implementation will often fall at the local level. And so that to me is one example, whether it's the San Francisco CEDAW being the beginning of that, to lots of other sort of very concrete, what is a city's policy going to be on a socio and economic rights access question. The other thing I would say, and this just comes back to Ian's point a minute ago, saying the cities don't quite know what the ask is.
Yeah.
Part of my suggestion there is it may be that cities need to make an offer. And in some ways, what cities are offering, in using my human rights example, is, hey, UN High Commissioner for Human Rights or UN, bodies of any sort, we actually do have some jurisdictional authorities on this, and what we can do to advance the cause is meaningful. But if cities thought about it more as an offer, it might be more likely to be taken up than when they make an ask.
What do you think about that, Ian? If cities make an offer rather than ask?
Well, of course, the classic structure of the communique is the offer from the cities and then the actual asks often around financing or something like that. So it's more like how to take knowing what the ask is and get it. And I think Bill's point is previously actually was a well taken one around changing of the mind frame or the perspective of people at the supranational level. And so if the point of some of the networks is, well, it's not their point, if one of the results of network engagement is the result of sort of a political movement, a change in the way in which multilaterals and international organizations and national governments, to be honest, because that's where a lot of the communication is happening, think about implementation of a global agenda or pursuing their respective interests, and think about cities, then that is obviously an accomplishment, and in theory, the sort of asks would follow. But that logic, I think, is an important one to say out loud, because it means when you're asking for funding, it means for when you explain your mission, that's what you're doing. And that's different from, say, technical exchange. And technical exchange there is something that is very important, around which city networks have had immense success. but it's a sort of different mission than that of changing the thinking of supranational organizations.
Lolita, I was just going to turn to you
Oh,
because.
I just wanted to add sort of what I feel is a nascent example of some of this working fairly well is in the area of migration, particularly climate migration. When you're talking about shocks that happen in other parts of the world, when you have global cities where there are communities of people from that country, the people who are affected by that shock will flee to those cities if they are able to get there. So one example that I can think of in the New York City example was the Haiti earthquake. I forgot what year that was, maybe 2010, as well as Hurricane Maria. We had an influx of children who needed to be schooled, fed, housed, adults being housed. And I know this has happened in other cities globally where we've actually talked to other cities, how do you do it? How do we work with international entities that can help us with that? And to some degree, maybe the actual countries may not be as helpful as the international entities. So I found that was a discussion that at the tail end of my tenure that we were involved in pretty vigorously with some other global cities as well.
That's interesting. So Michele, what do you think the ask or the office should be?
I think I'd go back, Jeannie, to what Ian was saying, in the sense that we don't give enough credit to the power of the technical exchange.
Yeah.
One of the problems is that then the technical exchange gets treated as just purely technical. There's a subgroup of C40 working on waste, so it's just the waste officers and the waste management folks. But there's actually a ton of, I would speculate, and this is pure speculation, that's been even more powerful than the mayor's presence at the table in prompting much more entrepreneurship and city diplomacy from the cities, as in from the staff that works in the cities, not just the mayor's office and the mayor. Because some places are blessed to have people like Mauricio, but I sort of kind of want 50 Mauricios in the city of Melbourne working across all the different areas. So I think a very practical ask actually from our side, and we're working on that best that we can in a way, instead of just providing training and support and advice and short training programs.
All about the delivery of services, the technical exchanges, how to better service the populations within their boundaries?
And no, I would say that it is recognizing, the practical ask for me would be recognizing that those that do that part of city diplomacy, that we badge as technical, really need much better recognition of the power that they've had in creating the systems of global urban governance. So recognizing that an environmental or a sustainability officer has as much importance as a mayor in this whole system, and giving those access to some of the conversations. I suspect that at times could go a long way in having a really productive conversation on funding and lending, or on pooled procurement across boundaries. So my ask would be sort of a much better recognition that the city isn't just the mayor, and that there's a whole cadre of people that need to be recognized as proactive and needing training, support, backing, space.
But you're basically talking about the management of the city, right? Finding better ways to manage this entity called the city?
Yeah, or the managers that we rightly so have given lots of space and attention to the politicians, but in most places in the world then there's a whole cadre. It's almost the same thing of saying, great to recognize the foreign ministers and the ambassadors, but we sort of want to pay a bit more attention to the Ian Klauses of the world of cities, and recognize that there's the career city managers that need a much better access and recognition in the system for all the work that they do. Because sure, C40 is the mayors, but it's not just those 96 mayors, is 96 times 5 or 6 managers and administrators and technical officers.
But the mayor sets the agenda and decides whether to empower those people. So let's bring this back up to the global level. What does this mean for these global agreements when you talk about really making cities work better, I think, through this technical exchanges? Why would somebody in the U.S. State Department or the Foreign Ministry of Ecuador, of Foreign Ministry in Australia care about that?
I'll give that one a shot, Jeannie. You know, we have to come back to what is the purpose of international diplomacy in the first place, right?
Okay.
It is fundamentally a problem-solving exercise. There is a problem, and now we're going to say, how do we best solve it? And how do we bring other entities to the table to solve it with us? And so I think from the way I see it, you know, you've got to show to the State Department or show to the UN or to the G20, right, that the subnational is an essential, perhaps a necessary partner in solving that problem. And when I started by saying, what's the breakthrough been in the last 3 years? The two biggest challenges we're facing are really great challenges for cities to show their necessity, their indispensability in solving the problem. But I think this has to change from a conversation of saying, give us a seat at the table, to saying we can help you solve whatever the problem is. And I think there's a gradual awakening to that idea. But that could be a leverage point in some ways to represent ourselves to the international institutional architecture, not as one more entity clamoring for voice, but rather as one more tool in the toolkit of problem solving.
Lolita.
And I'd like to add to this, because this is my lived example. Direct engagement is happening anyway. So you have people from countries, Minister of the Environment of countries, coming to the larger cities. I met with the ministers of environment in at least 5 different countries that would shock the State Department. And I talked about this earlier. And I think particularly the years that State Department wasn't active in climate, I think that we were just on our own as cities, LA, Chicago, New York, etc. Probably even some cities in Europe were undergoing this, where people on the country level, because of the size parity, New York City is the 10th largest economy in the world, they were just coming straight to us. So the Minister of Environment for Canada would come to New York, she'd go to California, and she'd go back home. She never went to DC, never told anybody at DC she was coming. And so that's continuing to happen, because that train has now left the station. So even with the Biden administration back in, now they have Gina McCarthy, they have John Kerry in place, but that's still happening, that sort of bilateral, not equal, but national level to the local level. So the State Department, and I know Ian could talk more about this, the report Transforming State by the Truman Center, they've recommended that there is an office or department of subnational diplomacy that actually has people in State Department working with the cities. So if I'm meeting with the Secretary of Environment for Ireland, that I actually know what the issues around Ireland are. Maybe there's certain things I shouldn't say or do, and help the cities actually feel more equipped to be prepared to have those conversations. So I guess my larger point here is that's happening anyway. So just making sure that people on both sides understand the ramifications, implications of not being informed of each other's activities.
We're going to come back to Ian in a minute, but I think Mauricio has something to say here.
Yeah, I would like to build upon what Bill mentioned regarding the fact that there are certain examples of fields in which cities are actually gaining a space gradually, probably not as fast as we want, but they are doing so. For example, migration. This is something that Lolita mentioned before as well, and we were talking about this yesterday in Bill's human rights class. I think migration is a great example at hand, because every week 3 million people around the world move to cities. So in spite of cities not having competences on migratory policies, cities are the ones who have to face the challenge, the pressure of receiving so many people on a weekly basis, in terms of having to deliver new infrastructure, new public services, to create more jobs, to accommodate migrants, and to create a welcoming environment for them. So in practice, cities are in charge of dealing with this situation. Now, what's for me encouraging is that since that's a reality, I think that countries finally realize that they have to work with cities to address this issue, at least in some places. And we've seen how there has been some initiatives for mayors to come together and to discuss ways in which they can establish a better atmosphere for welcoming migrants. And we've seen, for example, how in Marrakech in 2018, there was the Mayor Declaration on Migration, which was a very important component of the global compacts on migration and refugees. Cities have been working together with the High Commissioner for Refugees, with the International Organization for Migration, so on and so forth. Now we have the Mayors Migration Council, which is another interesting example of not a network per se, but as an initiative that came from having city networks joining forces. So I think this is a particularly interesting example of how cities are finding their way in the international institutional architecture. I hope we can have many more of these examples in the few years to come.
So you've really made the case around the table that cities can solve problems, and very important international problems as they're executed or seen in cities. But Ian, what about those people working in the State Department? They don't have that view, do they?
Mauricio's point makes me think, as we talk about issues that fit well with city diplomacy, whether it's city policy challenges that are domestic or international or transnational, that I don't think we can leave this conversation without talking about the current crisis, particularly because it brings back to the fore the concept that Bill laid out at the beginning around sovereignty, which is kind of meets in an interesting fashion with some of the things that we're pursuing. I thought Lolita's point was spot on, that the asymmetric diplomacy that happens between ministries and cities without, say, the ministry on the other side knowing it, is quite fascinating and probably impossible to fully track. We saw a little bit about this during the previous administration when they tried to restrict Chinese access to the U.S. Consuls as a way to sort of influence what that asymmetric diplomacy looks like. And we're charting progress. I mean, I think here, let's use the U.S. government as an example, so the State Department, not ministries, and we could talk about HUD and maybe DOT even. But Bill, and we're lucky to have him here, so I can bring it up. Bill, I think, essentially authored the 2010 QDDR, which was the first internal review the State Department did. It was followed by another one that I think was done in 2015 or 2016. And I recently went back to them along with the report by the NIC, the Global Trends Report 2040 that came out last year, to see how urban issues were treated. And it is striking the way in which the U.S. government appears, at least its diplomatic body, to talk about cities in different ways. So when Bill authored that report, cities were places for influence. They were sites of public diplomacy. They were where the people are, like the reason you rob a bank. And they were places that could potentially be sites of instability. And so they advised, I thought very well, outreach to secondary and tertiary cities where U.S. diplomats might not visit, because they are places where you could do public diplomacy. By 2015, the focus had turned to climate, and on the 2015 report references technical expertise around policy innovation. And so there was some recognition that there was government within these cities. The QDD, the NIC, the Global Trends 2040 from last year, actually called out cities as leading in policy and as actors themselves. And that evolution, I think, from cities as place, cities as container, to cities as actors, with policy steps in the middle, I think is an important one. It's a big deal, and it was hard won by lots of city networks and people inside of the U.S. government trying to understand the ecosystem a bit more. So I think that trajectory, which actually is probably happening much faster in other ministries around the world, and we could talk about that too in a comparative sense, I think speaks to the relevance of cities as problem solvers. And that to me is a story of success. Now, whether or not that leads to a really, really robust Office of Subnational Diplomacy, whether in the U.S. State Department or others, this is a totally separate question, because the bureaucratic implementation is different from the analysis sometimes.
What's happening in Australia with regard to the relationship? Well, you started out the day in this conversation saying it was growing more separate. Are you seeing anything favorable about within the ministries around topics that cities are engaged in, such as we just heard these examples?
I can probably give you a different answer in a month and a half or thereabouts because we've got a federal election. But the reality being, no, if anything, we're sort of one of the most blatant examples of this regard, in the sense that we disbanded the only system that we had for federal to talk to cities. And it's sort of created even more polarization between the cities that matter, that can be ignored by the state, by the federal system, and the cities that don't have a voice because they're sort of more marginal. So there's an internal politics of cities as well in the countries, not just us, but a few countries that sort of gone in that direction, where in the UK you can't really ignore Manchester and Liverpool, but it's easier to ignore other more marginal realities. I think that one of the interesting things there that I think it would be useful to build on what Lolita and Ian are saying is not just the recognition of cities as actors, which is crucial. There's really good evidence that that is the trend in the UN frameworks and statements and treaties, but also the power of cities not always having to go via the foreign ministry. So I'm super supportive of the Office of Subnational Diplomacy type initiative. We're advocating clearly for that to exist in this country because it doesn't. And it's been exactly the opposite. The foreign minister has come in and said, stop talking to China, you're not allowed. But there's a reality, like Lolita is saying, where it isn't just the foreign ministers. It might be too much of a sensitive conversation with the foreign minister, but you can go via the environment minister, or you could, in context, that have a migration minister that is separated, that at times Minister for Culture is the right way to go at, or in our case, where the Home Affairs Minister is actually the one that holds the power in that conversation, where you might have actually a very pro-cities foreign minister, but if the Home Affairs Department is not behind it, you just simply can't operate it. I think it's time to broaden that imagination beyond the foreign minister into the other things. And that's why, for instance, U20 is interesting, because it sort of opens up that conversation beyond just the diplomat cadre into the other ministries that are equally international. So we've got tons of examples like the one that you put on the table, Lolita, that is perfectly on point.
Do you have more you want to add to that, Lolita?
No, just everything he said is correct. And another thing I wanted to point out is that the UN does recognize these things because, in the example of New York, because we're the home city of the UN, they called on us all the time, as quietly as it kept, to help advise them on certain things, even have us as speakers on fora where it may have been all people on the international level that they'd asked New York City to come on and talk about an example of implementation in a very large urban space, since we do have 8.8 million people now. So yes, absolutely, I think that there's going to be more recognition as it goes and continues.
Well, they also called on New York to deal with parking tickets.
Yes.
Sorry.
Can I throw one thought
Yes,
out?
of course.
So everybody sitting at the State Department today is thinking about one and only one thing, right? And that is Russia going to invade Ukraine?
Right.
And cities seem pretty irrelevant when you're thinking about that. But as I was just thinking about it, do they need to be irrelevant, right? High politics of war and peace is probably the last place you think cities might have something to contribute. But you said something to me last night, Mauricio. You said, I think it was Anne Hidalgo had figured out how to sort of harness the global so that when things got rough at home, she had somewhere to turn internationally.
Yep.
And I wonder if the mayor of Kiev had actually been an active participant in lots of city networks. Could the mayor of Kiev be doing a bunch of diplomacy, calling on, his or her counterpart in Germany, saying, hey, Nord Stream 2, that really needs to stop. And obviously there's a connection that still has to get made back to the national level. Or I think of what Mayor Khan did when Donald Trump showed up in London a few times. The next time that Vladimir Putin decides he wants to visit Warsaw, I'm assuming he's not visiting Washington anytime soon, could a city network create a little leverage, or at least try to create some political support for more robust national government action? It's a stretch, don't get me wrong. But could cities say to foreign ministries, yeah, we actually can deliver something on the high politics issues, not just on, and I don't mean to belittle climate, but right. I think cities are being relegated to these narrow spaces, and maybe there's more they can offer that is of immediate relevance to the State Department.
I think that's a great point, and I think that it also works the other way around. So it's not only the fact that cities might influence national and global politics, but also by having an active mayor internationally, you can influence your national politics. For instance, as we speak, the mayor of Freetown, our good friend Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, is being harassed by the national government. I mean, the national government wants to kick her out of office. What is she doing?
You have no experience with that, right?
A little bit. A little bit. So what is she doing? She's turning her eyes to the international community, building upon her very active role of the international arena.
To shame?
To gain support, to gain international support that will put pressure on Sierra Leone's national government to think twice about kicking her out of office. So that's the point. Yeah. So there's also the fact that city diplomacy can become a very effective tool for those mayors who realizes the importance of it to get things home as well.
But that brings us back to the question of trust. I am imagining that Bill and Ian are in the State Department right now, and New York City decides to do something on its own because of whatever. And how would the State Department trust the cities to do the kinds of things that you're talking about, Bill or Mauricio?
Trust is tricky here.
Yes, it is.
Because in some ways, city diplomacy in the United States took off at a moment where there was distrust between mostly progressive cities and a mostly non-progressive, Trump government. And so, on one hand, the political divide creates the opening. On another hand, I could certainly imagine the State Department saying, a Democratic liberal mayor, we're happy to work with you, but domestic politics are always going to be at play, and I think that can be a little tricky.
Ian? You're on mute.
Well, I'm actually struggling with the question today of writing a statement for mayors to express solidarity in support of Ukrainian cities and towns, and so I've struggled a little bit with this question myself. I think Bill is right on. And actually, for those of us who advocate for subnational diplomacy, it's a question we have to ask ourselves. If we were sitting in that office, what would we be trying to get to the attention of senior officials within the U.S. government as something we can do to support Ukraine in this moment and peace and international stability more generally? And I do think that there are a couple rhetorical turns you can take. And there are some practical gestures. We have spent now a decade advocating that cities are crucial to solving global challenges. And if you see cities be denied their rights and the people within them to choose their own futures, you're also going to deny their ability to act on those global challenges. And so if it's true, cities can act together to solve global problems, the sort of denial of urban residents and those cities themselves of the ability to chart their own futures, which is one thing we might be looking at, denies sort of cities everywhere the ability to help shape the future. And another, and it's quite pessimistic, but unfortunately we have a lot of experience now with cities under cyber attacks or cities that have to be reconstructed after intense periods of conflict. And it goes from everything from development agencies to UN Habitat's work in Mosul, for example. And I think it's important to call that out and make clear that those resources will be available and that the cities that have the technical expertise to advance it will be willing and able to help as well, because it's a moment in which you are, I would guess, feeling quite alone that you're in Kyiv in terms of the international community, but you need to know that it's not going anywhere. That's less analytical and scholarly than sort of, political, but I mean, that's what I've been looking at today.
Tough. Let's imagine, it doesn't have to be the United States, it could be any country in the world, has a subnational office in a ministry. I'm going to say which ministry it would be. What would it do and where would it be? Michele.
Well, it's interesting in the sense that there are places that have ministries, right? So the question is probably what would it do better than existing examples, right? I'd say, well, I'd wish that it did a very simple thing, which is sort of it exists beyond short electoral cycles. That we've seen so many places that sort of had a minister for cities and then disappeared, and then it came back again, and then disappeared again. Because of sort of the attention for cities here very blatantly. Labour, so left-leaning, believes in having a minister for cities, has a shadow minister for cities. Liberal doesn't. It's infrastructure, right? Almost the opposite in the UK. So what it would probably do to be really useful is that it would institutionalize some kind of office and service that is almost that survives the political cycle. So it is probably something that sits across ministries, or something that has to require both sides of the conversation, the local and the federal, to change, because at a strike of a pen, at the pretense of we need more agile emergency conversations, the prime minister got rid of cities in 2020 here, right? So to me, the question is, how do we, I'd love a minister for cities, and I'd love a subnational office, but I'd also would love those things to last more than 3.5 years worth of electoral cycle.
Yeah, I would just add, to make that potentially issue-oriented or very specific areas, and as you said, it would transcend agencies and not just be in a particular ministry. So, of course, I'm going to advocate for climate because that's what I do, but maybe it's technology or something else that is, really affects a lot of the different agencies in the government, and you have someone that is helping to sort of collate that response with cities and giving them the information they need to be prepared. Because I would have loved to be more knowledgeable on some of the things that had already happened in the State Department regarding climate and cities more broadly in other places, in other countries. To be able to talk to, for example, I had many Chinese cities coming all the time. We were flooded with Chinese cities coming to New York to ask us for information. I had no idea what they were being told in China by the U.S. Embassy, for example. So it would have been great to be able to even just have that level of information sharing.
Mauricio?
I think the idea of having a ministry hosting a subnational government office is interesting, but it all depends on the institutional framework for it. Because particularly in those countries that don't have such a solid democracy, you may run the risk of that office becoming a tool for political control from the national government to the local government. For example, going back to Sierra Leone, it is the newly appointed the newly created head of the Ministry for Local Governments, the one harassing Mayor Akisori. So, you have to be very careful. Exactly.
Okay. Bill?
Two thoughts. One, ultimately our goal is not a subnational office. Our goal is integration. And a subnational office may be a step in that direction. It is also dangerous because you can relegate a set of issues to that office. I think of the Office of War Crimes issues at the State Department, right? You'd really like the human rights issues of preventing war crimes to be everywhere, not just in that office, and they can get marginalized. But I have 4 things that I would want such an office to do as a transition to the integration of the issue, right? 1 is actually direct engagement with foreign subnational entities. 2 is capacity building within the United States to help and support U.S. municipalities engaging. That's Lolita's point of, I would have liked to know what they were hearing, right? You already had the capacity in New York, but capacity building in a bigger sense. 3 is some degree of coordination, and this goes to your point, Mauricio. It's soft. It's not telling a mayor exactly what they have to do or say, but it would be nice if right now that office existed and it was calling around U.S. mayors saying, you got any ideas for us on the Ukraine crisis, because or things you might be able to do. And then 4th is actually elevating the substantive issues that are important to the urban agenda into the global conversation in multilateral fora and elsewhere, right? When clearing on cables that have to do with these issues, reading them and sort of substantively engaging the issues. But I'm not sure we're going to get there. We need Tony Pippa on that question.
That's right. We have a couple of questions from the audience here, and if anybody else in the audience would like to add any questions, we will report them. The first question came in and says, do we need a different architecture? I think we're going to hear some very specific ideas about that one. We have been hearing them obliquely, but not directly. You want to start with you, Mauricio? You're shaking your head.
I definitely think we need a new architecture that would recognize that the world has changed. I mean, by 1800, only 3% of the world's population live in cities. Now we have more than half of the population living in cities, and we'll have 70% of the population living in cities by the year 2050. So the world has changed, and therefore the institutional architecture should change as well, accordingly, to reflect the fact that cities are global players on its own right. And they deserve and they need to have a formal seat at the table. I think that that's already happening slowly in certain fields more than others. We need to accelerate that process, and particularly in concrete aspects. Sorry for getting back to the financial aspect, but for me that's the most important of all. Without access to resources, it will be impossible for cities to tackle global challenges like climate change, like migration, like resilience building, like pandemics, so on and so forth. So it is absurd to think that such relevant global players as cities don't have access to proper access to international finance. I mean, take the U20. If you combine U20 cities, you would have, I think, it's like the third strongest economy in the world. I mean, that's what we are talking about here. So the international architecture must reflect that. And this is the kind of discussion that I think that are already happening. And it will be a matter of time until things will get to a certain level in which there will be no way but to allow this new trend of growing importance of cities being reflected at this architecture.
We're going to turn to our international lawyer at the end of the table, who's thinking sovereignty is what I'm guessing.
Yeah, I was going to say, we have an international architecture built on the principle of state sovereignty. And that's why it's been hard for cities to get a seat at the table, because they're banging into the door of state sovereignty. State sovereignty is under enormous pressure today, in both good and bad ways, right? We have a set of global challenges that do not respect sovereignty. Nobody said to the COVID, sovereignty, stay out, and that didn't work so well. We also see sovereignty, though, being pushed on by Vladimir Putin today. Xi Jinping holds sovereignty close to his heart, but then says Taiwan is part of China, right? So there's lots of places where sovereignty is under pressure. But I think what we need today is an architecture built around problems and designed to address problems rather than built around principles. And so if you start by saying, how do we solve COVID? How do we solve climate? How do we solve human rights? Then you look at the architecture from a different perspective, right? You've got a whole array of different kinds of actors with different sorts of status and different sorts of capacities. And we say, how do we design an architecture that harnesses all of them? And that doesn't start with institutions that only let in states. So yes, we need a new architecture. The danger is you can't sort of let go of the whole old architecture, because it's also the old architecture that is the only thing keeping Putin out of Ukraine today. And figuring out how much you change it and how much you hold on to the old architecture in the process, I think is the big challenge.
Well, Ian, you're the historian in the group here. We know that the United Nations came out of the world wars.
Eugénie, you just teed me up. I was listening to Bill talk about, sort of principles versus solving challenges or problems, and I would think, and we could actually debate this historically, but I would take the position that a lot of the global architecture and the system in place today was in fact built to solve problems, or to solve the problems that were perceived to have led to World War II, particularly from the interwar years. And perhaps we need, this is what the Secretary General is maybe trying to do, is try to sort of advance on this moment, but we sort of haven't had the universal recognition, nor is there a sort of hegemon of sorts who can help to craft the system, like was crafted in the wake of World War II, that sought to solve those problems, and probably did a pretty good job of.
Well, there are 2 world wars, as you remember.
Yeah.
We couldn't get one after the First World War. It took a second one to actually get the nations to agree, as far as that goes.
Let's not make a second pandemic be necessary.
No, I was just going to say, we have to have a crisis to make this happen? I don't
Yeah,
know.
it's a constitutional moment, and that's what we were in 1945, and I think there's an argument to say we're in a constitutional moment today vis-a-vis climate.
Michele, you agree?
Yeah, I do. I definitely do. I think it's time to realize that constitutional moment, as in take our common future as an example, Eugénie, that you flagged before. Great, but there isn't tons of recognition in there by the Secretary General on cities. There's a mention here and there, right? There isn't like a major statement on it. Slightly schizophrenically seeing that the Secretary General's statement on the pandemic in April 2020 was a pandemic in an urban world. So I think it's sort of a point where the constitutional moment really needs to formalize in different areas, not just in climate, that it's made big headways. So, and migration, I agree with Mauricio on that. Really formalize that presence. It doesn't need to actually be a seat at the table. It just needs to be a table that happens right next to that table and speaks to each other. And yeah, I'm all for great statements, but then one needs to start having really institutionalized bits in the system, because otherwise we're preaching to the converted often.
Right. Oh, the questions are popping up here on the question section here. So Junie Solbrecki asks, any backdrops with including city networks of cities in the international arena, including more players in an increasingly inefficient field, might not be the answer, instead of focusing on improving existing structures?
Anybody want to take it?
Anybody want to take that one?
Judy's in my international law class, so she gets a lot of me, so I'm going to let somebody else take this one.
Okay. Can you improve the existing structures? Or do you have to start again? I think that's what she means.
I think we need to reform them substantially for the reason that Bill mentioned, because they are governed under a country logic, not a cities or a subnational government one. And it's clearly not reflecting the new reality in the world. So, and I agree that we shouldn't destroy the current architecture, but we need to promote deep reforms into it in order to accommodate these new relevant players like cities.
Well, Daniel Pajic is asking a similar question. I bet he's another one of your law students. And he's saying, as we move toward more formalized institutional relationships between cities and national governments, how can we ensure that in these reforms, cities retain their main advantages as international actors, flexibility, pragmatism, etc.? Anybody want to try that one?
I don't know, I think of Ian, your work on Chinese cities, right? The danger of coordination is suddenly then maybe a loss of independence, right? And cities have been an independent voice, and so it's figuring out some kind of soft coordination rather than handing talking points to a mayor.
Just very quickly to add to that, I think that we should preserve in any way we can the beauty of city diplomacy, which is the fact that it is non-political, is non-ideological. It is based on concreteness and cooperation spirit for the most part, unlike nation-to-nation diplomacy, which is highly political, highly ideological, and quite frankly, highly boring.
But we just had 2 people here, 2 if not 3 people, say maybe cities ought to be saying something and supporting what's happening in Kiev and supporting the mayor. And maybe if he'd been more active in the international arena, there would have been an upswing of influence of pressure on Russia. So how do you respond to that? Can cities be there and not be political?
Well, just on the first part of that question, I mean, I think the part of the stance on people in cities in Ukraine is it that we've long advocated that urban residents should have the opportunity to chart their own futures. And that is both in terms of what happens within their own cities, but it's also why they take a global position on issues like climate change, because it doesn't respect borders. And so New York or LA or San Francisco and its residents aren't asked to be active in climate change on the global scale only because it's a sort of a random principle, but also because, what Tokyo does affects New York, that sort of logic. I bet Lolita could speak to that phrasing much, much better. But on the second, I don't know, Mauricio, it's interesting. So let's play around with that a little bit. The World Urban Forum's coming up, right? And Michele keeps telling us, he's not going to go, but then he's going to fly in because everybody has to be there. And one of the things that I think is interesting about the World Urban Forum right now, and it was sort of interesting in KL in terms of the U.S. assets, is that under the theme of transformations, I think there's an open question about whether the process of transformation matters. And there can be top down or bottom up, there can be autocratic, there can be democratic. But if it's just driven wholly by the end result of the transformation in sort of a technocratic way, I think that doesn't speak to some of the tensions in the world today, some of the truly geopolitical tensions around autocracy versus democracy, that includes questions of rights. And so I tend to agree with you almost wholly, and we see that. And I echo your observation, Mauricio, but I wonder if it's going to be tested, and I wonder if at some point now it doesn't have to be tested a little.
Yeah, my point was that, for example, when I was a mayor and I met another mayor, I didn't care whether this mayor was from the right or the left, which is unfortunately something that in many cases prevent nation-state diplomacy to be fluent, right? This is not the case with city diplomacy. That's my point. And I think that's something that we should take advantage of. Because the other thing is that I also always saw a great cooperation spirit on part of mayors. You, as mayor, you want to share best practices, share knowledge. I remember city networks meetings with mayors in which everybody shared best practices and knowledge. And I, quite frankly, learned a lot from that. And I replicated many of the ideas that I heard in those gatherings. That's what I am referring to as a non-ideological kind of diplomacy. Of course, you will always have a political component, but as far as I've seen in city diplomacy, that's not an obstacle to generate cooperation. And that's something that we should preserve.
Okay, so that goes to the problem-solving abilities of
Exactly.
cities in dealing with problems. It doesn't deal with Ian's letter that he's trying to pull together for the mayors to support Kiev.
Exactly.
The question is, how do you separate that? We have a couple more questions here. Would a new architecture further entrench developed versus developing world dynamics, but at the city level? Yeah, Michele, you're shaking your head, you're not sure. Lolita, what do you think? New York was always called on because New York was quite developed.
Yeah, but we a lot of times we were willing and very wanted to share our knowledge and best practices with cities, particularly regarding this, if we had similar situations or shocks. So going through Hurricane Sandy, we were able to really have a lot of conversation around adaptation. And as I said, that migration issue, we had that very substantially over climate shock that happened in other places. So we actually had no issue. In fact, I worked very closely with the city of Pittsburgh, which is often surprising to people, but on many, many issues, because they took copious advantage of the networks, and they reached out to cities that had more capacity than they did and said, well, how can we learn from you? And so I think when you had somebody like me in those positions, we were willing to do that. So I think, if anything, it helps us in a diplomatic sense to be able to help these other entities get their capacity up and pass it forward. So that's something that we did, and I know other cities involved in a lot of these networks did so as well. And I didn't care if they were global south or global north, I would talk to anybody.
So that leads into a question that was one of the original questions as attendees were here. For intermediate and small cities in developing countries, engagement with international institutions is challenging, to say the least. What do you think are the best mechanisms for these cities to be heard?
I have an example. I'm sorry, I know I just
Go
talked,
for it.
but
No, that's all right.
I know that Resilient Cities Network is a network of people who are not mayors, and they are the chief resilience officers or some other position in government. And I actually had a conversation with Lauren Sorkin All of you were interviewed for my paper that I did for Perry, and I interviewed her for this. She said the cities that are in less developed or global south areas actually take copious advantage of the network possibilities. So whether it's a webinar, it could be Penang in, I think is in Indonesia, for example. There's some cities that are very, very active in these networks who otherwise would not have access to any of these things. So there are particular scenarios where they are able to take advantage, where they would not be able to do so bilaterally. They may not ever get the phone call back from the same city that they do it within the network framework. So there are institutions that allow them to do that.
So we like the networks. Okay, very good. That's terrific. I think it's time now to think about next steps. What, Bill, I'm going to start with you. How are you going to respond to this conversation? It's been really rich and very stimulating, many contradictions, many ideas floating about here. What should be the next step in advancing the roles of subnational government in international convenings and deliberations?
So, Jeannie, it's a great question. It's particularly timely. There's several convenings later this year in Katowice and in Poland and elsewhere. And I'm going to answer it in a practical sense more, what can the people sitting in this room do rather than sort of what should happen.
Right.
One thing that struck me in our conversation today is the need to make the case that cities can be relevant to solving problems beyond climate and beyond the pandemic. And there is a danger, I think, that cities get relegated into, not to say those aren't important places, they are, but seen as that's the extent of it. So I could imagine a study, paper, something that is prepared in advance of Katowice that really mapped a series of other issues where cities have some jurisdictional authorities, some capacities, and some track records for offering solutions. That could be presented, I don't know to whom, but also to just try to inform the debate of don't just think about cities in these two spaces. So there's one concrete thing that I think would be doable. You just have to go and sort of do some research around where cities have been active outside of those two spaces, how their jurisdictional authorities align, what they've accomplished, and I think that would be quite meaningful.
I totally agree with Bill. I think this conversation can become another step in the direction of keep building this idea of pushing for having cities performing a greater role at the international arena. And I think we can take advantage, for example, of the work that the Global Parliament of Mayors is doing in this regard. The Global Parliament of Mayors, as Ian knows well, is hosting their summit right before the World Urban Forum to discuss precisely these kind of topics. So we can, work along the lines that the Global Parliament of Mayors is proposing to come up with ideas and very concrete mechanisms that could be designed to keep pushing forward this agenda, to keep advocating for a greater role for cities during the World Urban Forum and beyond.
Okay, Ian, you said Michele's not going to the World Urban Forum. What should he do? I think
No, Michele, he
right?
just teases you. He says he's not going to come. I think Michele already provided an answer earlier in the conversation, and I thought it was a really exciting one. We'll see what he thinks and his family, but I think he said that Melbourne would benefit from 50 Mauricios. And so we could develop a sort of policy plan that's just 50 Mauricios in cities around the world, starting in Melbourne. But he has to run it by his family. No, thanks for that invitation, Mauricio, to mention the Global Parliament, because it is taking place right before, and it is a platform and a space to sort of have a conversation that could open up the aperture into other policy issues, exactly as Bill described. And I think when putting together that work, thinking about it, we would also benefit from the expertise that Melbourne does have with regards to where those cases have already been made, even maybe beyond climate and some of the other policy issues, because in fact there is a huge sort of ecosystem of networks that have tried to make this case on issues beyond just say climate or migration. But I think it's an exciting opportunity, and I do think that it's a moment right now when sovereignty is going to become something. I thought Kenya in New York issued quite a really fascinating statement that was numbered to maybe 15. And point 12 and 13 were points about heterogeneous societies that can be cosmopolitan and looking forward towards the future, that very much affirm the way many of us think about what cities can and should be. Those sit in balance with earlier points that were all about sovereignty. And I think that as we think about advocating for cities on the global stage, the analytical point that they should be there is that Mauricio makes very well. The normative point is clear, but I think that we're going to have to adjust slightly in a world where we have to affirm sovereignty as something that also protects our rights and ability to chart our own futures in our cities.
All right, so changing the dialogue, getting the dialogue more clear. Michele?
Yeah, and I'm still in the cards on move, by the way. It's just Ian and I are discussing this. Look, on a practical level, not making that dialogue just a part of the multilateral dialogue. That so often city networks and mayoral processes have just tried to emulate like literally step by step, let's issue a declaration and so on, the diplomatic process. And some of the best innovation has come from things that are city-based and have a city mentality rather than necessarily just trying to do what the UN does. But apart from that, just a big plea for solidarity and not forgetting the Freetowns and the Jakartas and Manilas and so forth. You can say whatever you want, but questions in the chat, I completely agree. The developing country context is the smaller cities, they're falling off the map if they're not well connected, if we're not paying attention to them. Then we can say, oh, Zoom has opened up a greater possibilities of participation. Well, tell that to our colleagues in Honiara or Suva that are trying to zoom in on bad internet connection during a cyclone that is battering your island and a major outbreak, or colleagues in the region here where your country steps in and says, you need to shut up now, you're a city, but I'm your country. So in a sense, not forgetting the solidarity and the need to allow a seat at the table for those players, because there's many Yvonnes out there in exactly the same situation, and they're just not getting the airtime.
Well, the question is how to provide that solidarity, and Lolita, you've got the last word here.
Oh my goodness.
It's a big responsibility.
Well, one thing I was going to add is that, my current roles in the private sector is showing me very clearly that the city side and the private sector side are not used to speaking each other's languages. And so we also need to include the thoughts of other sectors being part of this conversation. The private sector, the philanthropic sector, which many of you also know, most of the networks are funded by philanthropy, and so involving those entities in these conversations as well is very important, particularly because cities have a bit more flexibility and agility to be able to incorporate things like public-private partnerships and work with philanthropy directly. So how can we have some of those best practices actually roll up to the federal level as well? So really just more communication along the way until we get to these changed structures that we're trying to talk about.
Well, maybe there's a parallel paper for you to write on this one. So thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. Thank you for coming from California, from Australia, from Philadelphia, from Quito, from New York, and various places around the world. This has been a wonderful conversation. We hope to continue it at WOOF and other places. So thank you.